So now we're going to bring Reconstruction to an end. Focusing mostly
After a
on
while,
the two terms in office of President
whites,
Ulysses
especially
S. Grant,
former
who you see
Confederates,
there,
realized
that
today
they
at the new
could not
departure,
push back as
and
hard
then
as
the
they could
Redeemers.
against
the election of
Reconstruction governments of the
1872,
South. And so
the
they
Mississippi
adopted
Plan,
what was known as the New
Compromise
Departure.
of 1877,
The New Departure
which brought about the
was
end
the
of
Southern
Reconstruction.
acceptance of Reconstruction
After
as
Reconstruction.
far as they possibly wanted to go. That's important. They accepted African American suffrage and even worked from time to time as to help guarantee African American suffrage. For instance, P.G.T. Beauregard is often brought up as a subject of the New Departure. This would allow former Confederates to be restored into office. And so they would then turn and use their rhetorical skills and their public opinion strength to level charges of corruption against Republicans, especially against Reconstruction governments. With this in mind, you then had Redeemers, and that is Democrats who slowly but surely begin to win back the South. Case in point, the gentleman you see there, William Mahone, a former Confederate general who became one of the Redeemers and therefore was a Democrat that was elected into the legislature. Where, shall we say, political cooperation did not work, well, then you could often turn to violence, such as in Colfax, Louisiana, on April 13th, 1873, where more than 100 African Americans and a large number of white Republicans were killed as they were attempting to vote in what is now called Grant Parish, Louisiana. And it's Grant Parish, and Colfax was the name of Ulysses S. Grant's vice president, Schuyler Colfax. Ulysses S. Grant had largely a positive but not a spectacular first term in office, and so decided to run for a second term, as was his right. He would face Horace Greeley, a man who had not held political office before. He was a newspaper editor, and the Democratic tactic was to charge corruption in the Grant administration. Now, that there was corruption in the Grant administration is beyond doubt. Nonetheless, it was not as corrupt as you may have thought, and Grant won in a landslide anyway, and Horace Greeley was so despondent over this, he died just a few weeks after the election. While that's going on, the former Confederates in the South, white Democrats, decided that it was time to go in a different direction from the New Departure. And so he enacted what is known as the Mississippi Plan. This was the end of the alliance between Southern whites and Republicans. They would then now openly terrorize black Republicans, essentially intimidating them away from the polls. And when intimidation didn't work, well, then they would just simply rise up and have a big war. This was political violence used to overthrow Reconstruction. It culminated in the Battle of Liberty Square, September 1874, at the foot of Canal Street, where the White League and Southern white Democrats fought against the Metropolitan Police, made up of blacks and whites. The Metropolitan Police were driven from Canal Street, and Union troops under General James Longstreet, a former Confederate, had to be brought in to quell the riot. This is essentially the end of Reconstruction in New Orleans, and it signals the end of Reconstruction throughout the South. It starts the decline of Reconstruction. And so, at the foot of Canal Street, they erected a monument called the Liberty Monument. The White Leagues did it to commemorate those of their ranks who died. Well, in the 1980s, the Liberty Monument came under a great deal of fire for being a monument to white supremacy. And so, after a series of court orders and so forth, it was moved to the place it used to occupy right next to the flood wall by the Canal Street theaters. Well, of course, several weeks ago now, the Liberty Monument, along with the monuments of Jefferson Davis, Beauregard, and Robert E. Lee, have all been removed and placed into a storage holding facility, if you can call it that, waiting for their final dispensation. They're not to be destroyed, as I understand it. They are to be placed in a museum in their proper context. And as you well know, all these monuments and their removal has created quite a big storm throughout the city and throughout the nation. This is a map showing the electoral breakdown of the election of 1872, and even though Horace Greeley finished second in the popular vote, he did not win a single state and won only 3 electoral votes because Georgia decided to divvy up its electoral votes. And it shows you just how much of a landslide this was for Ulysses S. Grant. As I said, following the Battle of Liberty Square in 1874, this began the decline of Reconstruction as the North essentially starts to get rather tired of the whole thing. By the year 1876, there was yet another presidential election, and Ulysses S. Grant decided that 2 terms was enough in the tradition of George Washington and stepped aside. And Rutherford B. Hayes became the Republican nominee, whom you see there, and Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York, became the Democratic nominee. This was going to be a much closer race. What happened is that Tilden won the popular vote. However, there were problems in the South, most specifically the state of Florida. And so Rutherford B. Hayes' people offered a deal with the state of Florida. This was called the Compromise of 1877. Florida would give its 4 electoral votes to Rutherford B. Hayes. In return, Hayes would order all federal troops removed from the South. Of course, the Democrats charged corrupt bargain again, just like back in 1824 with John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay, but nothing really could be done. And so in order to get the presidency, the Republican decided to abandon Reconstruction. All federal troops would then be removed from the South. And so, thus it happened. The Civil Rights Acts, the amendments, all remained in place, but the South would not comply with it because they no longer had to worry about federal troops keeping them in line. And this begins the long descent of the South into resegregation and then Jim Crow, which will last for nearly another century. So what is the epitaph of Reconstruction? Oftentimes we look at Reconstruction through the lens or the prism of what is known as the Dunning School. William Archibald Dunning was a professor of history at Columbia University who wrote his major thesis on Reconstruction, in which he says most Reconstruction officials were corrupt. And this obscures Ulysses S. Grant's legacy. He also says that whites, quote unquote, rescued the South from nefarious blacks and carpetbaggers. This is the lens through which we look at Reconstruction. Going hand in hand with that, and it's not on your notes here, is the lost cause theory that was formulated by a Confederate general who wound up living in Louisiana named Jubal Early, who turned Robert E. Lee into almost a semi-divine human being, the Christian knight, the Christian soldier, the noble fellow that really didn't care much for slavery, when it is quite evident that Robert E. Lee had very firm beliefs on slavery. There's another aspect to Reconstruction and the end of Reconstruction, is that because the Civil Rights Acts and the amendments remained in place, the only way not to comply with those laws was simply not to spend money. That is, the federal government would not give you money for this or for that if you weren't going to make it equal. So then you would not do with this or that. And so you had a reduction of government services and funding. I call it the filled-in swimming pool with concrete. The law mandates that a public swimming pool must be integrated and blacks and whites must swim together. Well, suddenly the southern town decides, you know what? The swimming pool doesn't have enough funds to keep up, so they drain the swimming pool and fill it in with concrete. The South becomes a backwater this way. It becomes almost an economic vassal of the North after a while. The roads are terrible. The bridges are not well tended. The river levees, so. At least you have the Corps of Engineers doing that. The Democratic Party returns to power in the South, becomes the solid Democratic South, which is a far cry different from today, which is the solid Republican South. And you also have the reemergence of white supremacy. The fact that these Confederates and ex-Confederates had been pushed aside and not re-engaged out of a sense of doing them punishment made them so incensed that rather than re-engage themselves, all they did was plot their return to to power and making sure that they were the top rail. Finally, this electoral map shows how Tilden and Hayes fared. Tilden, again, president, won the popular vote, but he did not win the electoral vote. So you see that what happened in 2016 and 2000 was not the first and second times it happened. This has happened several times in the past where the president has not been elected by the majority of the people, but just simply the majority of the electoral votes. And notice that the crazy states of Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina went for Hayes because of that agreement.